Yeah, I've been also working with community for I do a lot of environmental affairs with the national level community, so I've done a lot of work at the national level and some work at a provincial level, but not as much. So yeah, so it's great to be working on it today. And my expertise mainly is not the one that he does, but I'm agriculture and the sphere component. So I've had a lot of experience with that. I've been in the other sectors, but efficient with agriculture and Danish. So it's today, so yeah, we look forward to projects as they say, we're trying to be flexible and so please ask questions that will allow us to.
And, maybe one more thing to add here, this is the first part of the support offering under this particular project we've been able to be supported by ICAT. We are also on hand, you and myself, and myself, to provide support to you with subsequent to this training with specific questions, with specific.
Maybe we can just go around the table. Do you sense of what you think about what you do, what you're involved in, and what is most of interest topics?
Good morning to those of you who have joined online. We are sitting here in Joburg with an audience that is just busy introducing themselves. And then we're expecting our online participants to start joining slowly. The official sort of training is only scheduled to start at 12, but when we thought we'd get going with just some introductions. So you haven't missed out on any content, and then we will get to those who are online for the introductions in a moment. So at the moment, we've just asked people to introduce where they're from and what some of their biggest challenges are in terms of inventory compilation. So we'll carry on around the room and then get to those who are online. And if we can use the mic now. So
Morning, everyone. My name is Matthew Sibonero from Gauteng Agriculture. We have a similar problem as well. We try to invite as many people as well, officials, to come and attend, at least virtually, the session itself. Well, that challenge of people get trained and then they leave, then you start from scratch again. So Gauteng is in the process of a project now, we're in the middle of it. But the idea is to have internal capacity so we can continue with the work. We understand it might be challenging, but that's the plan. Our interest obviously is industrial emissions and waste. Those are our big challenges. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Good morning, everyone. So I'm Jody Frank Brown. I'm from the Western Cape government. I'm sitting in the Climate Change Directorate, specifically working in climate change mitigation. And I'm also my colleague, Lisa Jennings. She will also be joining online a bit later. So our experience with inventory. So we, as I think of 2021, we completed our first full greenhouse gas emissions inventory for the Western Cape province. With the baseline year emissions using 2018. We also had some international support a bit, but we did it completely in-house with myself and my colleague Lisa. Myself, I'm still very new in the space, so I sort of learned hands-on in the process. I'm really looking forward today coming with a blank slate to sort of see the proper sort of, if I can say, academic way of going through the processes, etc. Because my experience was spreadsheets, formulas, etc. So just trying to understand sort of the theory around it. In terms of sectors that we are interested in, all the major sectors. Energy is a big one for us. A follow sector, which we had a service provider assist us with. So our expertise in that area is quite limited. So really looking to see how we can expand on that, as well as the EPU sector. And then, I think I maybe missed one, and waste, sorry, as well. And I think overall, some of the major challenges we face is data availability, trying to source the accurate and correct data provincially, and especially on the energy level. We use national data, of course, because we use the national grid information. So overall, just looking forward to the session and learning as much as possible.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ntabile Mahase. I am from the Department of Economic, Small Business Development, Tourism and Environmental Affairs, Free State Province. I am an environmental officer in the unit of air quality management. So back then we used to have climate change together with air quality. They were a directorate, then they were separated. I'm sure some of the colleagues will be joining online, especially Ms. Mpolukem Mokalobe, who's heading climate change. So we are from air quality. So I wanted to give that background because at this point in time, we have appointed a service provider who will be helping us with, we have an AQMP, but the higher powers have decided that we should develop it, not review it, because it was not up to standard. So in that, we will also be looking at our emission inventory. So hence we are here as air quality as well. Thankful that Mempul can share the information with us. So the challenges that we are facing, the issues is waste, industry, and yes. Thank you.
Thank you, Ntabile. Just if I may, just to welcome to those of you that are still joining online. to get the maximum out of the day. We've started with introductions in the room, and then we will turn to those who are online to give us their introductions. At the same time, you should have this morning received a link to a SharePoint folder from Feleng. If you could go to that folder and download the 3 files that you see on the screen, those will be very useful to you. So for those of you who have joined online, please try and download those files and put on the chat box if you are unable to get onto the folder, and we'll try and help you remotely. Franz.
Good morning, colleagues. My name is Vuta Malindi. I'm from Distia in Free State under Air Quality Management. I think my colleague has just outlined every interest in our province, but the personal interest, I'm new in the department, so it's one of the first. So I can't wait just to learn, to add value in terms when we deal with the AQMP in our province. Thank you.
Thanks, Vuta.
I'm Martin van Nierop from Gondwana Environmental Solutions. I'm the director at Gondwana, and I'm sitting in here to learn as much as possible today. I'm very glad that we have 2 experts in the room as part of our team to do the training. Thanks, Luann and Brett.
Good day, everyone. I'm Fezile Moyana from the Department of Agriculture, Rural Development, Land and Environmental Affairs in the Mpumalanga province, responsible for climate change coordination. The issue that we have in our province mainly is relating to just transition. Since Mpumalanga is like the hotspot of just transition and everything, so yeah, just helping the communities so that we make this just transition just. Yeah, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Tulisile Mukoka from Department of Agriculture, Department of Agriculture, Rural Development, Land and Environmental Affairs, under Environmental Policy Planning Coordination and also Climate Change Coordination. I'm basically here to learn everything that I can get, except in the space of what we do in the GHG inventory, apart from speaking to a few municipalities on what they were doing. It's exciting to come and learn on what I can do at a provincial level, what more we can provide so that we know what we're talking about at some point, what this is and how do we assist them. So it'll capacitate us in terms of making sure, and also the issues that Fezile was talking about, the just transition as well, and how do we assist in that space, because we fairly new as we're now going to be like having a full-on structure for climate change. So hopefully there'll be more things to learn and start finding ourselves and linking everything that we need to do. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And then we're going to turn to, sorry, our 2 colleagues from Gondwana, I don't think introduced themselves. We have Daniela and Feleng.
Hi everyone, I'm Daniela from Gondwana, and I'm here to take all the notes and help you guys with any issues that you might have online. Feleng is here. Are you busy? Can I introduce you?
Hi everyone, my name is Feleng Litlaila. I am also part of the Gondwana team. I am just here to learn as much as I can as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Feleng. I'm now going to turn to the people who are online. So I'm just going to go in order of the list on my screen. So Claudia.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Claudia Freisenberg from the Western Cape Province, Department of Environmental Affairs and Development Planning. I'm from our Air Quality Management Unit. And yes, we have a good relationship with climate change in our department. So yeah, we are just having a background in greenhouse gas emissions would be of great help. Thank you.
Thanks, Claudia. Then I've got Mgomezulu.
Good morning, colleagues. My name is Dane Zulu, and I'm from Gauteng Department of Agriculture, Rural Development and Environment under the unit of climate change mitigation. So we are developing, as Mateo has said, we are developing the GHG inventory. So I'm here to learn more about the tools and guidelines to develop it. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. Amanda.
Good morning. My name is Amanda Ndiweni. I'm also.
Sorry, Amanda, can you speak up a little bit? We're battling to hear you.
I'm sorry. I don't know if you can hear me now.
Okay. It's a bit low. Okay, if you can write in the chat, that's a good idea. Thank you. Rafiel, where?
Good morning, everybody. My name is Refilo Dikwele. I'm from the Department of Environmental Affairs in the Free State and the Air Quality Management Unit. Like my colleagues have already outlined, that we are busy with the review of our AQMP, and I do believe that this would be beneficial to us in terms of being capacitated in terms of emission inventories, as it is part of the study that will be done to review our AQMP.
Perfect, thank you very much. Sally.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Sally Benson. I'm from the Western Cape Province. I'm in the Department of Environmental Affairs and Development Planning. I'm in the Air Quality Management Department and Directorate. And although we do have an air quality management plan, we continually update the Western Cape emissions inventory. So this is why I'm here. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Sally. Sean.
It is muted.
Sorry, Sean.
But actually, sorry, Sean.
Cindy, where?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Cindy Mashale from the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment under the Climate Change Mitigation and Specialist Monitoring Services Chief Directorate. I'm responsible for coordination of the National Greenhouse Gas Emissions Inventory and also the management of the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program in the country.
Great, thanks. And then we're going to hear more from you in a few minutes. And then finally, Siamtanda.
And Gentile from Eastern Cape.
Yeah. No, we can't hear you, unfortunately. If you don't mind introducing yourself in the chat. And then finally, I've got one person who's marked as unknown user. I don't know if that's a participant or if there's anybody who hasn't introduced themselves, please jump in now. So great. Yeah. Great, thank you. So Luann is going to be posting a registration link into the chat box. Please fill that in. And then also, just for those of you that haven't got access to the training folder, if you can post in the chat box, I think Phileng's busy trying to sort that out as we go along. So make sure you've got access to the training materials and download those 3 files for those of you who haven't heard before that are kind of in the root directory. So I think that's it in terms of introductions. Should we move straight into the welcome from DFFE? We're a little bit early. Should we ask Cindy? So Cindy, a question to you. We decided to start early because we had a lot of participants online, just to get introductions out the way. I don't know if we're ready to dive then into the welcome from DFFE. If you can advise us on that.
Yes, we can start.
Okay, that's great. Is that going to be yourself giving that?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, then the floor is yours. Thanks, Cindy.
Thank you. So I'd like to welcome everyone to this workshop. This workshop is part of an initiative that we initiated as the National Department responsible for climate change, MNE. As a result of the requirements for municipalities and provinces to implement the requirements of the climate change bill, which will soon become an act soon. As part of that, we identified some of the gaps and the capacity building needs that municipality might need in terms of being able to implement the requirements of the act, and hence this initiative. So we are supported by the World Resource Institute in terms of implementation of this project and the funding that was made available in order for us to be able to implement this project, as well as ICAT. So we are very grateful to our partners and also to have you as municipalities here to be able to conduct this capacity building initiative. I'd like to welcome everyone and also our service provider, Gondwana, who will be coordinating this training for us. Thank you.
That's great, Cindy. Thank you very much. I mean, I guess you can then just go on into your next presentation, which is the introduction to inventories and the GPC guidelines.
Okay, thanks. I'll just load my presentation on my side if that's acceptable.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah, we can see it.
Please confirm if you can see it. Okay, so I will shortly be giving an introductory presentation in terms of the guidelines that we are recommending for provinces and municipalities to use in terms of compiling greenhouse gas emission inventories at a subnational level. As you all may be aware, is that we have the National Greenhouse Gas Emissions Inventory, which is updated on a continuous basis. Currently, we are in the process of finalizing the 2022 inventory, which should be published in the next 2 months or so. So we have a good profile in terms of our emissions at a national level. But in order for us to be able to implement the requirements of the Climate Change Act, provinces and municipalities need to have inventories that are disaggregated at a subnational level in order for them to be able to implement action to reduce those emissions. And this goes beyond industrial emissions. So in my presentation, I will take you through just a brief introduction on why greenhouse gas emissions inventory at a subnational level are important, and also go into the framework that we're proposing, and according to the framework, also align the accounting and reporting principles and how inventory boundaries are determined under the protocol, and also recommendations in terms of the structure of the report as per the protocol. And also, just to summarize, key considerations that municipalities or provinces should take into account in the development of subnational GHG emissions inventories. So the first thing to consider is that in order for us to be able to make or plan anything with regards to climate change mitigation, we need to understand what our emissions are. And also to be able to monitor those emissions on a continuous basis. So our ability to take effective action depends on us having good quality data in terms of GHG emissions inventories. So I included this slide in terms of the national emissions profiles just to understand where we are as a country. Even though this doesn't give a complete picture in terms of the provinces and the municipalities, I think it's critical that we keep this in mind when we are going through this training. So our latest published inventory was the 2022 emissions, the 2020 emissions inventory. And what we have seen in that inventory is that the emissions were highly impacted by the slow economic activity during 2020 due to COVID-19. So our emissions, national emissions were standing at 468 megatons as a country, which, if you look at the profile and our targets that we have committed to as a country, is that we are below our target, which is 510 megatons. But if you look at this emissions in line to what we have committed to be as a country in terms of 2030, is that even considering COVID, there's a lot of work that needs to be done for us to be able to meet the limit for 2030, which is 420 megatons. And these are the limits that I'm talking about, the limits that we have committed to internationally under our national determined contributions. So in terms of the importance of provincial or municipal inventories, is that it will enable municipalities and provinces to set targets at a localized level so that emissions reduction programs are targeted to the major emissions within the local sphere, because different municipalities will have different emissions profiles. So it is important to also, even though we have the national picture, to also have the emissions at municipal level so that climate action or climate change mitigation can be aligned to what are the major emissions at a local level. And it will also enable municipalities to develop climate change or climate change mitigation strategies, and also to be able to monitor if any of the programs that are being implemented are actually making a difference in terms of emissions. So having the inventories at a local level and also ensures that there's accountability and continuous monitoring of emissions at a subnational level. And also what is important as well is that once you understand your emissions, that you'll also be able to allocate resources or align your programs according to what the picture is within your emissions inventory, because you'll be able to understand what are your emission hotspots and priority areas for mitigation actions. And also the subnational level will also assist us at a national level to be able to improve the data that we are using for emissions inventory development, because currently it's on a top-down approach. But if there is data from the local level, we can also be able to implement bottom-up approach and also be able to use that data for verification purposes to actually confirm as to what we are seeing at national level. Is it really in line with what's happening at a local level? So we've considered all these requirements in terms of what municipalities need to do, and we looked at international guidance that is available that will assist municipalities to be able to compile the GHG emissions inventory. Just to take note that at a national level, because the inventory is compiled for international reporting purposes, it doesn't go to the final detail. And also the guidelines that we are using are the guidelines from the IPCC. So they are not exactly this guideline, which will be presented here today, which is tailored for municipalities and provinces. So we've considered this guideline and are recommending it to be used by municipalities because it also provides a clear framework on existing methodology for calculating and reporting municipality GHG emissions. And it also provides clear guidance on how inventory boundaries should be defined. And also the accounting framework that's considered in this guideline can be applied at any subnational level. So that is province, district, and local municipality. So during this training, that is the guideline that will be presented for greenhouse gas emissions inventory development for municipalities and provinces. So also the guidelines provides clear accounting and reporting principles, which are the first step that needs to be considered before any inventory process can be initiated. So these principles, for example, are completeness, consistency, transparency, and accuracy. So just to touch on one of these issues, which is transparency, we need to ensure that whatever activity data or emission factors are used and accounting methodologies are used in the development of emissions inventory, we need to ensure there's adequate documentation to be able to understand how emissions inventories were developed. And also clear documentation also enables verification of these emissions by other parties that are not involved in the emissions inventory development process. And the other principle of accuracy, which this guideline also will ensure that the emissions inventory at a municipal or provincial level are accurate, will ensure that you are able to assess that the GHG emissions are not systematically overstated or understated in comparison to the actual picture of how emissions are within the area. So in terms of accounting and reporting principle, this is just an example of how we are implementing this principle at a national level and to ensure there's consistency. So what we have in our reporting system, we are currently using spreadsheets for the development of the emissions inventory. But what we are doing is that common spreadsheets need to be used for all the years when the inventory is updated. So what we include within those spreadsheets is the activity data for the different sectors that were used. It's just that my screen is not clear. For the different years up until the latest inventory. We also include the emission factors that are used for each activity. And in cases where its data is sourced from another model or another spreadsheet, we have indicators within the spreadsheet to indicate the data sources. We also have also indicate within the spreadsheets when data is extrapolated or interpolated, and also when certain values are assumed. And we also include within the spreadsheets all the checks that are done to ensure that the checks that are done to ensure that we have transparency within the process for anyone that is not involved in the inventory development process to come in and see what we are doing to ensure that our emissions are credible So this is what we are also recommending for the municipalities and provinces, is that when you do start the process of compiling emissions inventory, you need to use basically a common system. It doesn't have to be spreadsheets, but where data can be transparently shown in terms of what was used to estimate the emissions, what are the emission factors that were applied, and if as part of the QC process, you also need to keep a track of the comments that were made. And this also ensures a continuous improvement of the inventory compilation process going forward. So also the guideline provides guidance in terms of how to define emissions inventory boundaries. And this is very important when you are starting the process of compiling an emissions inventory. So there's different definitions of how you can approach this. So the first one being a community-wide inventory. So within the municipality, you consider all the sectors that are contributing towards the emissions, which is the residential sector, the commercial industries that are opened or operating within the municipality, industrial emissions, as well as transport emissions. But within the community-wide inventory, you also have municipal operations that are contributing towards the emissions within the municipality or province. So that will be activities such as waste facilities and other activities where the municipal has direct operational control. And it is important to also, when you are compiling the inventory, to indicate which activities where the municipality has direct operational control and where the municipality does not have operational control, because this then influences how you then strategize and determine how you would address those emissions after the inventory is compiled. So within also defining the GHG emissions inventory, there are different scopes of emissions that need to be considered. In the national inventory, we'll only consider scope 1 emissions. These are direct emissions that are emitted within the country. But within this protocol, there's also what we term as scope 2 emissions. And scope 2 emissions are the emissions that are a result of the use of electricity within the municipality. And then scope 3 emissions are other emissions that are outside, that might be outside the municipality, but as a result of activities that are happening within the municipality. An example of this would be if there is waste that is generated by the municipality but is not landfilled within the municipality, then that will be considered scope 3 emissions. So you see here in terms of the national inventory, it doesn't address all of those things, which is why then the emissions inventory at a subnational level then become critical, because then you'll then be able to then determine what you need to do to address all of these emissions. So I think I've covered this as well. So in the slide before, but also the guideline provides guidance in terms of how you would then report the emissions that you determine under your inventory. So we have there is what is called basic, which are the basic emissions that need to be included in the inventory. And then there's what we call basic plus reporting, which is in addition to the minimum emissions that need to be included in the inventory. What you can include if there are resources available is emissions under the basic plus. So the basic emissions that need to be included is all scope 1 emissions from stationary energy sources, and also all Scope 2 emissions, which are emissions from the use of electricity, and Scope 3 emissions from the treatment of exported waste. But if there are additional resources available, then you can also include emissions from industrial processes and product use, and also include emissions from the land sector as well. So in this training, we'll cover all the methodologies that need to be used for the different sectors. So also the protocol also provides guidance in terms of when you are compiling the report, what is the information that needs to be included. So the first one, being the important one, is how you determine the inventory boundaries. And also once you have determined the emissions, you need to report them by sector, by scope, and also by each greenhouse gas. So considering also what I've touched on in the previous slide in terms of whether you've considered basic plus or basic. And you also need to include information on methodologies that were used for each sector and information on how emissions are changing over time. So some key consideration, just to summarize everything that I've presented so far, is that the first one is that you need to consider the principles of emissions inventory development before you start the inventory, which are completeness, consistency, transparency, and accuracy. And the second one is you need to be clear on the boundaries that you set before the inventory compilation process begins. As I highlighted in the previous slide, there's the community-wide emissions, but there's also emissions where the municipality has direct operational control, and there needs to be a distinction between the two. And also the sources and sinks, the setting of boundaries or identifying emission sources needs to be aligned with the boundaries that are set in the beginning of the process. And then obviously then the next step will be then to quantify those emissions and then set up an improvement plan to improve the emissions inventory over time. Because one of the challenges in compiling an emissions inventory is data availability. So you'll not, in certain cases, you will not have data for all the sectors that need to be included in the inventory. But what is important is to take note of those and implement an improvement plan over time to ensure that the inventory becomes complete as you start this process of compiling an inventory and you implement subsequent inventories from the first one. So an improvement plan also needs to be considered in the cycle of inventory development. So yeah, that is the end of the first presentation. Thank you. I don't know if you want to stop here and ask questions if there are any, but I'll also be presenting the next presentation on behalf of my colleague as she is in another meeting.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Cindy. And that provides a really excellent framing for the training over the next few days. So just before we carry on, just to the few people who joined online in the middle of that presentation, we did decide to start a few minutes early because we had everybody in the room and have a number of people who, so we've got a lot of material to cover over the next few days. But we haven't started on the actual content of the training. We just wanted to give the framing. So welcome to you. And please check if you've got access to the SharePoint folder that was shared with you this morning. If not, please post on the chat. And also if you could introduce yourselves on the chat to those people who haven't introduced themselves already. Okay, do we have any questions for Cindy at this point? Or are we gonna, do you think those questions are gonna come up as we dive into how we do all of the stuff she's described? If you got a Noloyiso.
Okay, no, thanks very much, Cindy. Just a very quick one. Let me know if this can be answered during the training. If then the province would have used the IPTC guideline as opposed to GPC, would it make so much difference in terms of the data boundaries and definitions and everything that you've just described now?
Uh,
If
Go ahead.
or if there are questions. Okay. So in terms of the direct emissions, it will not have an impact because also the guideline makes reference to the IPCC guideline for certain methodologies that need to be used, for example, for the energy sector and for IPPU. But there are certain there are certain scope of emissions which are not covered under the IPCC guidelines, which is the scope 2 emissions and also the scope 3 emissions. So it will have a difference in terms of that. So that's why then the guideline then becomes important in terms of setting the boundaries of what the emissions inventory should cover.
Great, thanks for that. Sorry, to those of you who are online, we've got at least 4 people monitoring hands, so we really want you to participate as much as the people in the room. So please put up your hand at any point and we'll make sure that you get to contribute. Any other questions from anybody in the room or online? Okay, great. I think, Cindy, a lot of those questions will come up as we carrying on with the training. And then, so now what we do is we start immediately and we go into the individual sectors, and we're going to start off with the energy sector. And so the way we're going to run each of the sectors is we have a representative from DFFE providing a kind of a framing on the sector, and then either Luann or myself will go into the specifics of how you go about compiling the industry for that sector. So Cindy, all yours. Cindy, I think you might be on mute. There we go.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I can't see the screen while it's on presentation mode. Let me put my presentation back. Please confirm if you can see the presentation.
We can still see it on the sort of development mode, not the slide mode yet, not the slideshow mode. Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
Thank you. So I will be presenting what the GPC is recommending for the energy sector. Rumbizai Munduri was supposed to give this presentation. She is our energy sector expert within the inventory. But she had to join another meeting where we were also required. So I'll just provide a brief introduction, the methodologies that are recommended, and also cover an example for the stationary combustion and transportation. And also in terms of the GPC, cover what how information needs to be reported. So the energy sector covers quite a number of activities that need to be reported. One of which being the stationary energy sources that are used within a municipality. So this will be combustion of fuel from residential, commercial, institutional buildings and facilities, which include manufacturing industries as well. And if there are any power plants that generate electricity, that will also be covered under stationary energy. And also this sector also covers fugitive emissions from the extraction, transformation, and transportation of primary solid fuels. So an example of this will be the fugitive emissions from coal mining. So if these emissions occur within the municipality, then they will be reported under stationary, under energy. And also the energy sector also covers emissions that from the transportation sectors. So this includes emissions by road, rail, water within the municipal boundary. And also the emissions that are produced, as I've indicated, the scope 2 emissions that are produced by the indirect use of combustion fuel, so the use of electricity for within the municipality. So these are the sectors that are covered, the complete sectors that are covered within the GPC. And also within the guideline, it also indicates whether there are scope 1 emissions, scope 2 emissions that need to be considered for that, and also scope 3. As you can see, for residential buildings, you need to consider scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. This is where residential buildings are using fuels for heating, for cooking. You also need you'll consider that under scope 1, and where residential buildings are using electricity, then those will be considered as scope 2 emissions. So I'm not going to go through each individual one, but as you can see, there's clear guidance on for each sector, for each subsector within the energy, whether you need to consider both scope 1 and scope 2. And this is according to in terms of basic and basic plus reporting. You will see there's different color coding that are highlighted for each scope. So for scope 3 emissions, they are considered mostly under basic plus reporting, but then you will see the lighter blue, if I call it that, that is considered under sources required for basic reporting. So it provides clear guidance in terms of how emissions need to be classified. So in terms of the methodology for the energy sector for direct emissions, there's a simple methodology that is used, even though the data collection is not as simple. But what is required is activity data for the different sectors, and then you multiply this by the emission factors. And emission factors that can be applied here are the IPCC defaults, or what we call country-specific emission factors. We've have initiated a number of studies at a national level to at least sector able to, consider country-specific issues. We've developed country-specific emission factors for liquid fuels, and that is publicly available information, and it can be applied at a provincial, district, or municipality level. And we also have initiated a study to develop solid fuels emission factors as well, and this can be applied here. So in terms of the activity data, I will get more in detail in terms of what activity data is used, but in most cases, it's just the fuel consumption that is used for the different activities that are outlined in the slide before. So also in terms of reporting of emissions, as you may be aware, is that when you are estimating emission factors for methane and nitrous oxide, you need to convert this to CO2 equivalent. So what we are currently using in the country is the second assessment GWPs, but in the latest inventory, according so that we move and are in line with international reporting requirements, we'll be using the FIT assessment GWPs. So when you are estimating your emissions, you must also consider which GWPs you are applying, and this needs to be consistent when you are updating the inventory, so that you ensure that there is consistency in the inventory, and when you are assessing the trends, you are able to actually assess changes in the emissions and not just changes due to the methodology that was applied. So in terms of activity data collection, this can be done on a top-down approach or a bottom-up approach. In the country, we have different systems that are available, that are collecting data for the energy sector, for example. So one of the sources of data that we are recommending for the energy sector is that there is a reporting program under the equality. These are some of the categories that are covered. So some of the data can be sourced from the National Reporting Program to feed into the province or municipality inventory compilation process, even though this does not cover all the sectors that need to be covered. So in terms of the data that is required, so you will need the consumption data. So in the cases where you are using fuel use, for example, for stationary and mobile, you can be able to access some of the data from DMRE, where you can use the fuel sales data to feed into the energy inventory compilation process. If this does not work, there are other scaling methods that can be applied in terms of getting the activity data. So in terms of inventory compilation, this is the step that is most challenging. So you will need to find apply some assumptions in certain cases using national data and scale it to the district level using certain assumptions. That's what we are referring to scaling methods. And in some cases, you might need to apply modeled data. So it doesn't have to be actual real fuel consumption data that is applied in cases where the data is not available. Scaling methods, you can also take national certain consumption assumptions and apply that at a regional level. So in terms of the guidance, it also provides guidance in detail for each of the provide a definition of which emissions are covered in that sector. As you can see here, where it says residential buildings, it's all emissions from energy use in households, and commercial buildings and facilities, all emissions from energy use in commercial buildings, and so forth. So you will need to take this into account when you are reporting. So it's also important to consider when you are actually compiling the emissions. So this is just another description of how the activities are defined as per the guideline. So Here, it provides also a guidance in terms of how certain emissions need to be handled that are linked to the energy sector. Because sometimes you have landfill gas combustion. So if this is used as part of the waste disposal process, it needs to be reported under waste. But if it's used for energy generation purposes, then it needs to be reported under the stationary energy sector. And that is the same for waste incineration and also biomass incineration. So you also need to consider, if waste is incinerated, is it incinerated to generate energy that will be used, useful energy that will be used, or is it just a waste disposal process? Because if it's waste disposal, it's not considered under energy, but it's considered under the waste sector, which I think will be covered in the upcoming presentations later in the week. And also in terms of the transportation sector, there's also guidance that's given in terms of how you would handle certain sectors. So, for example, if there are off-road vehicles that are used for agriculture, forestry, fishing activities, or any other off-road activities, then it needs to be considered, even though it's used in the agricultural sector, it's not considered as part of the agricultural sector. It's considered to be stationary energy sources under agriculture, forestry, fishing, and activities. And also in terms of burning of agricultural residues, this will be reported under agriculture. So the guideline provides a lot of detail in terms of how you need to handle certain emissions and which sector they need to be reported on. So this section will provide you guidance in terms of what you would classify as stationary combustion, for example. So there's quite a lot of definitions. I'm not going to go into each individual one. So here as well, there's further guidance in terms of how you would handle off-road emissions. And yeah, as I've indicated, there's quite a lot of definitions. I think this presentation is provided. You can also be able to go through it and be able to understand how you would classify emissions. But the principle behind all of it is that for each category, the guideline has specific definitions that need to be considered, and how you will then classify certain emissions that belong under that category. So also the guidelines provides information in terms of how you would then report this emission. This example that is included here is the transportation emissions. So emissions from fuel combustion from the transporting occurring within the municipality, there is a certain they need to be classified under scope 1 if there is direct fuel consumption for the different transport subsectors. But if there's emissions from consumption, that is, for example, if there is electric buses or electric vehicles that are used within the city, it is classified under transportation, but it needs to be included under scope 3. So if then there's emissions that are occurring within the municipality, as a result of, for example, if there are vehicles that belong to the municipality, but this go beyond the city boundary, then those emissions need to be considered as scope 3 emissions. So this is just one of the, as I've indicated, the activity data that is used for energy, for stationary combustion or for transportation is fuel sales. But you can go to more detailed where you can look at vehicles kilometer traveled and modally based data, and this becomes more detailed data. But in most cases, the fuel sales data is sufficient, but there are limitations to it, as it's indicated here in this in the slide. So, for example, it will not capture all on-road travels, as vehicles may be fueled at location outside the municipal boundary, but driven within the city. And for example, it does not disaggregate the reasons for travel. So it doesn't give enough detail in terms of in terms of accuracy. There's certain limitations to the data, but however, it is less costly to implement, and this information I think is also available at DMRE and is disaggregated by the different jurisdictions within the country. So it's an easy methodology to apply in terms of transportation. But you can go to a more detailed methodology, which is the vehicle kilometers traveled. But it is more expensive and a time-consuming exercise, because you will need to apply models. You need to also implement data collection surveys as well. So it is more detailed, but it requires more time. So in this case, this also touches on what I've highlighted before in my first presentation, is that when you're compiling the inventory, you need to consider what you have, but then build based on your resources available an improvement plan to improve certain data that is used within the inventory compilation process. So also in terms of the transportation sector, if you are to go to the more detailed inventory, you will look at in terms of the trips that are happening within the municipality. You will look at in terms of the residents' activity. And also you will also need to complete vehicle kilometers travel surveys based on the activity of residents within the municipality. So it's quite a lot of it's quite detailed, but the guideline does provide all this guidance in terms of how it can be applied. But obviously, the more simpler way is using the fuels data, which is looking at the volume of fuel that is purchased within the municipality, and then you can then be able to get an inventory for the transportation sector within the municipality. So this just goes just outlines in terms of the different approaches for data collection, what you will then be able to get from the different approaches that you can apply, whether you use the fuel sales approach, the city-induced activity, the geographic or territorial approach, or the resident activity. So this is just an example of how you would then calculate your scope 1 emissions for the energy sector. For example, for the residential sector, if you know how much LPG is used in households, you will then apply either the country-specific emission factors that are available from the IPCC guidelines, or the country-specific emission factors that have indicated that we have completed studies in the country to consider what are the actual country-specific emission factors, because the default emission factors consider international data. But when you go to the country-specific emission factors, it considers country-specific level data. And then you will then be able to get the emissions for CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide. So you'll multiply the activity data, which is the fuel use, multiplied by the emission factor. So once you have calculated these emissions, you need to then report them in as per the GPC. But before you do that, you need to convert the emissions to the CO2 equivalent, as indicated in the example. What was used here is the third assessment report, GWPs. And then you will then have to then report based on the total CO2 equivalent for the sector. As you can see, the table for reporting is per total CO2 equivalent, is not per GHG. Then the emissions that we calculated above will belong to the stationary energy subsector, and it's scope 1 emissions. So then you'll allocate these emissions under scope 1 under stationary energy. But also in terms of the guidelines within the energy sector, you need to consider scope 2 emissions, and these are the result of emissions as a result of electricity use within the municipality. So in terms of this, also the methodology is quite simple, is the activity data multiplied by the emission factor. So you will need to know, for example, how much electricity is used by households within the municipality, and you multiply this by the grid emission factor. We have started a process within our climate change mitigation unit because we see this as a critical indicator for assessing how we are transitioning as a country. So we've compiled the first official grid emission factor, which is an emission factor which tells you based on the electricity you are using, how much CO2 is being generated. So these are official published numbers, and will be updating this on an annual basis. So the factor that we have now is the factor for 2021. So you will take then the amount of electricity that is used and you multiply it by the grid emission factor. And then you'll be able to get how much GHG emissions are linked to the use of electricity within the municipality. Yes, so this is just a link that is also provided within the presentation where you will be able to get the officially published greenhouse, the grid emission factor. Previously, ESCOM was compiling the grid emission factor, but it wasn't considering the other power generation sources from the independent producers, for example. So this number will provide a complete picture and will update it on a continuous basis. So then you will then allocate these emissions as per the protocol under scope 2 emissions under stationary energy. So also as part of the reporting process, if there are certain emissions that you are not able to estimate, you need to also apply what we call notation keys within the report. So one of the notation keys that you would use, for example, if there's certain data where you have emissions that are estimated, but you consider this data confidential, so you would, to ensure transparency, you'll just include a notation keys where you use the notation keys C, for example. So if there's a certain activity that is not occurring within the municipality, you just within that table for reporting include the notation key not occurring, which is NO. If the emissions are occurring within the city but are not estimated due to data availability, you will then include a notation key not estimated. So these notation keys are recommended to be used to ensure transparency, to say if there's certain data that's missing within that reporting table, what is the reason that data is missing. And the other notation keys that can be used is included elsewhere. So in cases where you're not able to go to a detailed level, for example, for certain emissions, but you can include them at an aggregated level. If there's certain information that's required at an aggregated level, you can then include the notation included elsewhere, for example. But I think there is an example within the slide that is, so within this table, you see that in terms of scope 3 emissions, if these are not occurring, you will use not occurring. And if there are no other scope 3 emissions that are occurring as a result of activities from the municipality or province, you will include NO. And also, if there are no scope 2 emissions from transportation, for example, if there are no electric vehicles within the municipal or province boundary, you will under scope 2 indicate not occurring. Or if these are occurring but are not included under transportation, and maybe they are embedded under stationary combustion, then you would include the notification key included elsewhere. And this is just important for transparency, for example, because when you're compiling an emissions inventory, sometimes it's not possible to cover all the sectors in the first process, but in terms of reporting, you just need to provide that explanation in terms of why certain data is missing. So yeah, this is just a nutshell of what the energy sector covers within the guideline. Obviously, there's more detail that is within the guideline. This just gives an overview. And I think the colleagues from Gondwana Services will take you through in more detail, and also in terms of the examples that can be applied. And thank you. This is the end of my presentation.
Let me get my mic on. Thank you very much, Cindy, for that great and I think very detailed overview of reporting on the energy sector. So just to let you know, the way we're going to be running with this is, for what we're going to do now is we're going to, or in the next session, is to go into each of those subsectors and talk a lot more about how we're going to reporting on them. So we're kind of using a kind of reinforcing approach with this training to ensure that you get deeper and deeper understanding. So don't worry if you didn't get the nitty-gritty, and I'm not going to quiz you on, what subsector number is residential buildings, because that wouldn't be very helpful to you at this point. So I just want to see if there are any sort of high-level questions, recognizing that we're going to get into the detail for the rest of today and tomorrow. Yeah, go for it.
Thanks so much. Just a couple of questions. Yeah, and I'm happy for you to also indicate if we're going to cover that a bit later. But the one was just around energy. So, for example, Western Cape, we get our energy obviously from the north. So, assuming that will maybe be scope 3. But then more specifically, some high-level questions I saw, for example, transport is separated. We include transport within our energy sort of sector. So is it advisable to actually separate those? Then also in terms of emissions factors, so where's actually the place we should be getting that from? How often should we look for updates, etc.? And how do you ensure you're sort of using the right one? Also noting the grid emission factor as well that was mentioned. Then also the GWP, the warming potentials. So how do we sort of getting into that in a bit more detail, what it actually is. I mean, I have the textbook definition, but also just in sort of actually understanding and then sort of seeing the different assessment reports that it changes. So how do we know which one to use? Do you just use the latest one, etc.? And yeah, I'll maybe just leave it there for now. Thanks.
No, Jody, thanks for raising all of those questions. Cindy, I'm going to ask that you keep your list and make sure that by the time we get to the end of energy, we've covered all of them. So I think we will cover all of them. The only one, Cindy, is does DFFE have any guidance on which assessment report global warming potentials to use? We will talk. I can talk to you a little bit more about what are global warming potentials when we come to it. But Cindy, is there any guidance there? I mean, would you suggest moving to AR5, given that that's where the national inventory is going in the latest release?
Yes, that's what we'll recommend because based on the latest recommendation for international reporting, it is recommended that we use AR5. And therefore, just to align with our national emissions, then municipalities are recommended to also use AR5.
Okay, thanks for that. I mean, a lot of municipalities that have prepared inventories have, I think, used AR2 to align with what was being done nationally. So now it's time for the switch over to AR5. So thank you for that. Matthews.
Just on same point, why not AR6? I'm not sure if maybe.
Well, that's a good question.
Depending on when the actual process for the next report started. And I want to get deeper into the grid emission factors as well. Maybe we'll get deeper later. If you have the generation emission factors, and then you have the transmission and the distribution, why those are, but I think it's me, I need to just understand. Thanks.
Okay, we'll try and get into those factors, a little bit later on. I mean, the AR6, AR5 debate, I'm going to hand over to Cindy as well. I think it's about national practice, global practice. Cindy, any thoughts on that? Why we don't just jump straight to AR6?
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's because we are aligned with international reporting requirements because as per the latest enhanced transparency framework, what is recommended is AR5. So when that recommendation changes, then we'll then have to align globally, not just as a country.
Yeah. Thank you. And I mean, AR6 only came out, I guess, the beginning of last year. And so people and the inventory preparation starts quite far in advance. So I think one can't keep up all the time with the latest inventories, with the latest assessment reports. Noliso.
Thanks, Brett. Quickly, Cindy, that's the use of the notation keys. Do I have any responsibility to provide the link, or let's say under IE or in notation key, so that if someone clicks here, they can get there? Do I have to do that, or someone else? That's someone's responsibility.
Cindy, you can answer it, or I can. I think it's just about presenting a reference to where it's included elsewhere. So you could say it's included under 1, 2, or I2, whatever it is. Because if you're presenting in an inventory report, you can just provide the sector where it's included in. Yeah. All right. I'm seeing no other hands online or anybody in the room. So yeah, I think a lot of this will be answered, and if you can just keep those questions coming, that's great. Okay, so we had scheduled for those that are following the schedule to have a lunch break at 1 o'clock. Maybe just to give those online the understanding of why we started, and then we immediately going into a lunch break, which we will have to align with the venue's requirements. It was to allow people to fly in from around the country and get here this morning. So hence the late start today. But what we want to do for the next 10 minutes is we would like to ask you to open up the Cirrus tool. So everybody should have the SharePoint link by now. And what we're going to be using in demonstration of the compilation of inventories is a tool that was developed to parallel the GPC, okay? So in order, so although one doesn't have to use this tool to report on your emissions, the CIRRUS tool provides a really nice way of arranging the necessary information in order to produce an inventory report. So it's a Excel-based tool that has a whole lot of macros in it, and it aligns with the GPC. So it covers the sectors covered by GPC, the subsectors covered by GPC, and it allows you to input the information that you have and do some of the calculations necessary to calculate your inventory. It doesn't, and we're going to see this when we get to the photo sector particularly, it doesn't help you to do all of the background data processing to get to the point of having your activity data. You do need to go and do some thinking about it. It doesn't specify the emission factors in answer to your question, but it does help you to organize the information. It allows you to enter information about where your data came from. It allows you to specify notation keys, and it just helps with that organization process. So you'll see as we go through this training, every topic will, or a lot of the topics will stop and give you the opportunity to see how this could be put into the CIRRUS tool in order to help with inventory compilation. Has anybody actually used CIRRUS before? Oh, Matthews has. Okay, so you'll be able to help us out here a bit with the trainings. So CIRRUS is free for download, obviously, and let's have a quick look at it. So I'm going to just sit down and project it onto the screen. Luann.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, has anyone used any other tools specifically besides using spreadsheets? No. I don't know if anyone online has used different tools. I mean, because there's also the IPCC software, which could be used, but that's, following the IPCC guidelines. Yeah, just curious to know what tools are being used. Okay, so mostly spreadsheets.
Okay, so if you open up the CIRRUS, tool, sorry, Lisa, go ahead, please.
Hi everyone. Sorry, I just thought I'd raise one of the issues. Some of the challenges that government quite often has is that we can't actually use software that is not Excel because of licensing and also getting permission to actually install it on our computers. That's the big challenge that we've had. Even if it's a free software, our IT departments are like, we're not going to install it because we don't know where it comes from. So that's a big challenge that we have, which is, I think, why we've been Excel based for the last 10, 12 years.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you for raising that. Okay, so if you open up CIRRUS, and hopefully everybody's got it downloaded. So it's an Excel tool that leads you through the tool using, so it's got inbuilt macros, but you don't have to worry about those. And it has sort of different sections of information included in it. So the purple gives you a little bit of kind of the background information. Then the orange sections give you some of the information that you input around the inventory. Sorry, just one point I think that Cindy did raise is, unfortunately, they do make very strong use of the word city. So every time you see the word city, substitute province. When you read the GPC guidelines, they say we talk about cities, but we mean provinces as well. So I guess subnational would be a bit long to put in every time you saw the word city. So it asks you in the orange section to fill in information about the city and the emission factors, which I'll come back to, Jody. And then the blue is the actual inventory data that you put in. The red is a couple of calculators, which I'll talk to you about later on. Those are quite handy tools if you don't have specific information available to you. And then finally, the blue is all the results. And what's really nice about the way the results are presented is that they do align with the kinds of reporting requirements that Cindy was making allusion to. So that thing around scopes and sectors and gases can all be obtained from the from this tool. And then finally, there's some notes pages just for your kind of free notes. So those color codings are to help you know where you are in this tool. So there are two ways you can navigate. You can either click on the click here to begin, arrow, if you like, or you can actually jump. If you know where you want to go, you can jump yourself. It doesn't restrict you from going to put in your city information or restrict you from going straight to the inventory section. It's up to you how you want to navigate your way through. And sorry, a final point is at the top here, there's a further navigation bar. So it gives you multiple ways or multiple directions for navigating your way through this tool. So what we're going to start with over here is we're going to start with just some of the purple, the purple tabs, if you like. And what you'll see here is that the purple tabs give you information that has been extracted from the GPC guidelines. So the critical information that you need to know to help compile your inventory. It obviously doesn't give you all of the detail that's in the GPC guideline, but it does help you understand, as Cindy's already shown, the different sectors and subsectors and where things are reported. I'm going to come back to the scopes thing to make sure that we fully understand it. And I'm going to come back to the idea of basic and basic plus reporting a little bit later on. But essentially what these tabs do is it gives you all this background information. Here's a description of all your sectors, etc. It then goes on to just revising what we said about the notation keys, and it gives you a little decision diagram on the left-hand side here to help you decide which is the appropriate notation key for the data. So what is a notation key? A notation key is just a way to help provide further information about data availability. So it says to you, if you don't if you haven't reported data under a particular sector or subsector, give us a little explanation for it. Well, your explanation might be it doesn't occur, okay? You're sitting in Mpumalanga, you might not have ocean-going vessels, okay? It doesn't occur. You don't have an ocean for it to happen, okay? Or you don't have mining emissions in a particular province, so you won't have fugitive emissions from mining. So you just give it a little annotation, NO, and you can give it a little description as well to say we don't have mining in the province or whatever the case may be. Included elsewhere is where you don't have sufficiently disaggregated information. So you might have grouped all of the electricity under buildings, for example. So you can't go down to the subsections. Not estimated might be that we don't have enough information to report on something, and confidential might be that you're not able to report the data. So if you've only got one industry operating in your province and they have given you the data confidentially, you might not be able to include it in your inventory. So we have a whole lot of notation keys. Global warming potentials we'll have a little chat about, but we have decided that maybe a fifth assessment report would be preferred to align with national reporting. And finally, there's a whole host of conversion factors. And these are my favorite things because I'm so bad at conversion factors between kilowatt hours and terajoules and gigajoules and all that sort of thing. And so this I really enjoy because it helps me do those conversions. And it builds it into the model as we go along, or builds it into the spreadsheet. Okay, so those are the purple sheets that you'll see in the Cirrus tool. We're now going to move on to the orange sheets, and this is where you provide background information on your province. It's quite important to do the specification of your background province here, because when it comes to your reporting in the, the navy blue things, it actually requires some of the data from here. So it picks up the province name and where it's located and odds and ends else, which assessment report you're using, etc. So you might not have heating degree days and cooling degree days, but you should try and specify as much of the information here as you can in order to help with the reporting later on. You could put in a map, and you can provide various bits of detail about your inventory. And then very important, who was the inventory compiler to help with this issue, which we've heard from, I think, 2 or 3 provinces about institutional memory. So who do you talk to, and then all the information about it. I think Luann and I have suggested that your homework for this evening, please, is to go and fill in the city information so that you get used to the feel of the spreadsheet. We're going to be working with the inventory section, but please go and do this. And then data sources are another critical aspect in terms of institutional memory and in terms of auditability of your inventory. So there's a little idiosyncrasy, if you like, around this thing that takes a moment to work out, is you'll see that there's nowhere to add in data sources on this sheet. So where you can't see somewhere to add in data sources, if I try and type here, it gives me an error on my screen which says the cell or chart is protected. So what you have to do is you have to click on this little button that says add. Do you see on the left-hand side there? Yeah. Okay, and then you say to it how many rows you want to add. So you click on the little pull down button. Sorry, it's not appearing on the Teams for some reason, but yeah, or you can type in what the number. You can type in the number. Okay.
Sorry, if you don't get a little drop down list or it's not working for some reason, in the little cell where it says add, you just type in the number of rows you want. So if you just type in 5, then it should give you the 5 rows.
As soon as you've given it, thanks for that, Luann. I haven't come across that problem so far. Yeah. So if you put in, then it gives you 3 rows, and this helps you to provide this kind of audit and memory trail around where you get your information from. And obviously, the more specific you can get, the easier it is for somebody who's trying to do next year's inventory to know where they should go and have a look for information. So it says, okay, what data are we talking about? Example, emission factors. What is the source of data? Well, it's a national emissions factor database. Who provided it to us? What year did it come in? What period does it cover? How often is it produced? What scale is it at? National or provincial or whatever the case may be. And then you provide a link to that data. So in order to really make that, increase that transparency, it's very important that you do this. And believe me, it's worth, you might think, oh, I've got to do my inventory quickly. It's really worth the effort to do this properly. I think I see Luann's nodding, and anybody who's done these inventories before knows how easy it is to put it on the back burner and how critical it is and how you kick yourself afterwards in order to, when you come back. Okay. So that's the data sources, and go and play with that. And then our emission factors. So this sheet is pretty critical around putting in your emission factors. And the reason for this is that all of the other calculations pick up on this sheet. So this is not just for record keeping. This is a critical data input sheet that we're going to use. So I'm going to come back to that a little bit later on where we do emission factors. Again, you've got the add button on the left-hand side, and you either choose the rows. You can add rows all the time, right? You don't have to say, oh, I need 10 emission factors, so I must put them all in now. You can add them later on. F gases we'll come back to later on, but F gases are a type of greenhouse gas emission, or a type of greenhouse gas, sorry. So you record the F gases emission factors separately from your other greenhouse gas emission factors. Cirrus import is if you want to import previous year's inventories. I'm not gonna spend too much time on that. Or in the CRF. The CRF is just another reporting framework used by the Global Covenant of Mayors. It's called a Common Reporting Framework, and there is transferability functionality between the two tools. So I won't spend too much time on that. Okay, that's the intro material for the Cirrus tool. I don't know if anybody has any questions on that. If just checking it's working on all your machines, because it does require these macro capability. So hopefully these are your machines aren't blocking macros as well, but hopefully that should do it. I don't know how strict they are on lunch timing here. Do we have any sense? Okay, I want to talk a little bit, maybe give, sorry.
Just a quick comment. Yeah. So, I mean, as Brett says, we're going to talk a little bit about the Cirrus tool, but it doesn't mean, that we prescribe this. If you have prefer the other tools or spreadsheets, that's fine. You should carry on using that. So whatever you decide your choice is, or whatever you're currently using, over the next a couple of months while we support you, we will happily support you on whatever tool you are using. So it's not necessarily prescribed. We just thought we would introduce it since it's part of the GPC protocol. So, but yeah, whichever so think about, I think you should think about which tool you use, which one's going to be most useful. And as you say, as Lisa said about, you may have other restrictions. So whichever tool you choose, the most appropriate one for your province. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that, Luann. That's an important point to make. Okay, actually, I think let's take a break for lunch now. Should we take the full hour? Should we come back a little bit earlier? Could we maybe reconvene at 10 to 2, say, so we can really get going and get into the substance? Okay. Pardon? Yeah. So apparently lunch is down that side. Is that right? Okay, thanks. Okay, for those of you online, we'll see you back at 10 to 2, and then we'll carry on from there. Thanks. Okay, we're just going to give everybody a minute or two to return from lunch, and then we can get started. I think we're missing 2 or 3 people. Let's see if they're outside. Okay, I think we can get going. I think we've got most people back. All right, so we're quite excited now. Now we can dive into the meat of the content. So we're going to start working on the energy sector, and really the purpose now is to dive into the kinds of data we need and the emissions factors and some of the challenges and really get to grips with the content that Cindy presented to us before we went on lunch break. I'm wondering if this isn't the best format to project in with a Teams meeting, then we can maybe look at switching over. Let's see how we go. But I think the first question Jody raised is, what is this idea of an energy sector? Okay, and what do we talk about here in terms of energy? So energy in terms of the GPC is divided into stationary energy and transport energy. So Jody, that's the answer to your first question. Is stationary energy is really the emissions from station energy are the emissions associated with the burning of fossil fuels, okay, in various stationary applications. So we refer under the GPC to buildings, we refer to industries, construction, energy production, or electricity production we talk to mostly in this training session, but the GPC talks to not only electricity, but cooling and heating production, and then energy use for agriculture. And I'm going to really harp on this point of the distinction between energy use in agriculture and emissions from agriculture, which Luann's going to do in a couple of days' time. So the stationary energy sector largely refers to these emissions from coal, emissions from gas, emissions from oil, etc., any other fossil fuels that you can think of. But there are 2 other considerations that we take into account when calculating the overall emissions from the energy sector. Sorry, by the way, we're going to give you all presentations, so you're welcome to take as many notes as you like, but this presentation is already on the SharePoint folder, and I'll carry on loading the presentations on before we have the session. So certainly scribble down notes, but you don't have to take everything down. So it's largely the fossil fuels from combustion of fossil fuels, but we also talk a little bit about what is called fugitive emissions. So we'll come back to each of these in turn, but fugitive emissions are emissions that escape from certain activities. Okay, so what do I mean? Well, coal inherently has methane contained inside your coal structure. And when we mine coal and when we process coal and when we transport coal, that methane can be released into the atmosphere. So you guys from Mpumalanga will have a lot of fugitive emissions from the coal activities, okay? And similarly with oil and gas systems, when we transport, when we take the oil and gas out of the ground, there is a possibility that there are emissions released into the atmosphere before we capture all of those emissions for fossil fuel usage. And those are also called fugitive emissions. Similarly, when we transport gas in pipelines, there is the potential for that gas to escape into the atmosphere, and that is classed as fugitive emissions. So that's not burning, that's the transport of it. And then we have a final category which we consider under stationary energy, and that is an allocation, if you like, for the losses of energy during transport of that energy. So what am I talking about here? When we transport electricity in power lines, there is a loss of electricity, and we need to account for that electricity. Similarly, when we generate heating and cooling, there can be a loss of that heating and cooling as we transport it, and we consider that under the kind of transmission and distribution elements. So those are the three categories that make up our stationary energy sector. Well, it's a subsector in the GPC, and transport I'll come to tomorrow. So I want to start with that. And these are nice, easy ones, particularly the ones on the left-hand side. The ones on the right-hand side are a bit more complicated because they fall very nicely into the, that's much better, thank you. These fall very nicely into that formula which Cindy put up. Remember, she put up an equation which said emissions equals activity data times emission factor. And this is the one on the left-hand side, the burning, is a nice, easy one because it fits comfortably into that equation. The others are a little bit more complicated, but we'll come to them a little bit later. And what is an emission factor in terms of Jodi's question? An emissions factor is the amount of emissions or the quantity of emissions that is emitted for every quantity of fuel. So it might be the kilograms of CO2 emissions that is emitted for every liter of petrol or diesel burnt, or the amount, the kilograms of CO2 per terajoule of gas that is burnt. That is an emissions factor. It's for every energy value of those fuels that we're talking about, how much emissions are put into the atmosphere. Okay. Now, we don't only put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, CO2, right? Fuels can give rise to different emissions, or activities can give rise to different emissions. And the most common ones that we talk about are CO2, methane, CH4, and nitrous oxide, N2O. Okay, so those are our main gases, but there are a whole lot of other gases which we talk about in terms of the GPC. And so we have the different greenhouse gas emissions. And in order to bring them back to a common unit of measure, which we call CO2 equivalents, we use that global warming potential. Okay, so we had that discussion about the global warming potential. So what is it? You've read the textbook definitions, was exactly how you put it earlier. Okay. The global warming potential is a conversion factor or a multiplication factor that allows you to express the global warming impact of that gas relative to CO2. Okay, what do I mean by that global warming impact? What's the issue with greenhouse gases? Greenhouse gases trap heat in the atmosphere. Everybody happy on that concept? And I know many of you have heard these concepts, but I think it's quite important to bring those of you that are starting out onto the same page. So forgive me if this is stuff you've heard before and you know about. Okay. So carbon dioxide traps heat in the atmosphere. Okay. For every kilogram of carbon dioxide, so methane does exactly the same thing. So does nitrous oxide. Okay, but they do it more so, if you like. In other words, they have a higher ability to trap heat in the atmosphere. And so for every kilogram of methane, it's worse than a kilogram of carbon dioxide. Okay? And the global warming potential is a conversion factor to relate a kilogram of methane's heat trapping capability relative to CO2. Have I lost you or have I brought you on board? Pardon? You lost. Okay. So different gases trap heat in the atmosphere. You understand that concept. So the reason why we have global warming is that we have more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere from burning of fossil fuels and from agriculture and from all these things. We're getting increased levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Yeah? With me so far? Okay. So every kilogram of carbon dioxide that goes into the atmosphere and stays there, okay, these gases stay in our atmosphere, they trap a certain amount of heat. Okay. So as we go up of the concentration of carbon dioxide, so we're trapping more and more heat, and that's why we've got global warming. With me so far? Okay. Yeah? Yeah, okay. So the thing is that not all gases trap heat to the same degree, okay? Because of the force, I don't want to get too much into it, but because of the molecular structure or the structure of those molecules, they will have different impacts in terms of retaining heat, okay, in the atmosphere. Yeah? Okay. So in order to bring them to a common unit, so sorry, what I'm trying to say is 1 kilogram of carbon dioxide does not have the same heat trapping capability as 1 kilogram of methane, and it doesn't have the same heat trapping capability as 1 kilogram of nitrous oxide. Okay, they all trap heat to a different degree. Yeah, because the molecular structure. So in order to get a common unit of measurement, scientists have worked out how much heat a kilogram of methane traps in the atmosphere, and a kilogram of nitrous oxide traps in the atmosphere, and all other gases relative to carbon dioxide. Okay. Yeah. And that relative factor is used to bring a kilogram of methane to the same basis as carbon dioxide, and a kilogram of nitrous oxide to the same basis as carbon dioxide. And that multiplication factor is called the global warming potential. Okay, so it's a multiplication factor on the mass of CO2, on the mass of gases, to bring them back to the equivalent of carbon dioxide. Okay, and every few years, yes, Luann, can you please add?
Basically, the point is that when we measure the greenhouse gases, we're measuring methane, nitrous oxide, and CO2, and you can't add them. It's like adding apples and pears. And so you can't add them. And so we use the global warming potential to make them all potentially apples, and then we can add the numbers together. And that's the reason why. It's because we want to be able to add them all together. So those that don't have global warming potentials, you don't add in. So it's just so that you have the ability to add them together. They must be in the same units, and that is the CO2 equivalent.
Thanks, Leanne. Okay, and every 4 years odd, scientists revise their estimates of those global warming potentials, okay, based on better understandings of the science, and they tweak those numbers. And when I say every 4 years, a report is published called an assessment report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And there they will update the numbers of global warming potentials for methane, for nitrous oxide, and a whole host of other gases as well. And that's why there's this debate about which of these assessment reports do you use in your inventory, because they're constantly updating, and there are various decisions that need to be made about aligning with global best practice and aligning with the national inventory. And so we make a decision. Well, we've heard today that probably what's called the fifth assessment report, not the latest, but the next to latest report, is the one that's being used in our national inventory and could be used for your provincial inventories. Okay, Jody, does that answer most of your questions around GWPs? Okay, I'm not seeing any hands online, so I'm hoping we can go on. All right, so where do we get these emission factors from? Going back to, so the global warming potentials are widely published. You can find them on the internet, and you can also find them in the GPC guide, which is on the SharePoint folder. There's a table of all of the GWPs. But where do we find these emission factors? In other words, if you burn a liter of diesel, it gives you this much emissions, or if you burn a liter of gas, it gives you these much emissions. So the government, DFFE, has brought out a guide which has an extensive list of emission factors, okay, based largely on the IPCC. So back to your question earlier, Nolo. So they're largely the IPCC emission factors, but there are a few tweaks for local conditions, okay? And that'll give you, and it's a long document. It is again on the SharePoint folder. You'll see it there. And that says if you burn gas, this is how much you get. If you get diesel, this is how much you get. If you produce X chemical, which we'll get to tomorrow, these will be your emissions. So there's this full like guideline, a real 200-page document or something, which will give you those emission factors. And I would argue that is your starting point for working out, calculating your emissions, looking for emission factors. I would guess that chances are you will never need to look beyond that. You'll find all you need in that guideline. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that the guideline is written as a document that goes with the greenhouse gas regulation. So it only covers the sector in the guidelines that are covered in the greenhouse gas regulation. So you won't find agriculture and waste. Waste is limited because agriculture, effluent and waste is not really in the greenhouse gas regulation. So those technical guidelines are covering all those aspects that are within the greenhouse gas regulation.
So yeah, waste we'll get onto in a couple of days, and so these are the kinds of things that you might see in this document. If you're going to have a look at what are the emissions associated with burning coal, well, it says for each terajoule of coal, and there are different kinds of coal listed, you'll give off 94,600 kilograms of CO2. For each terajoule of coal, a small amount of methane, because coal goes through full combustion, and N2O similarly. And it gives you numbers for diesel and for petrol and for natural gas. Okay. And so those are the kinds of things that you will see in that guideline. Okay, so what we could do is we could go and put these into Cirrus, but let me just talk to you briefly about electricity emissions, because Cindy did mention this earlier. So historically, a lot of people have used the emissions factor that has been published by Eskom. In their 2022 report, you'll see that they had an emissions factor of 1.02 kilograms of CO2 equivalents per, tons per megawatt hour, kilograms per kilowatt hour. But as Cindy pointed out earlier, the Eskom only takes into account their own generation. There's a whole thing around whether you count renewables or not in that emission factor. So DFFE has been working towards, and very successfully, publishing a national grid emissions factor, okay? And that national grid emissions factor represents all the electricity that's generated in the country and is fed into the grid with some tweaks, etc. And so the latest one, as Cindy put up, is 1.013 kilograms per kilowatt hour or tons per megawatt hour. And there's that reference there, and it's valuable to keep on looking for updates to that every time you produce an inventory. I mean, Jody, you had a question about what grid emissions factor should one use, and we will get back to that later on, but typically the GPC says you've got to use the national grid emissions factor for the accounting. Okay, so that's the little bit on global warming potential and emissions factors. Can I just take a quick pause there and see if there are any questions? And then if not, we're going to go and quickly put those into the Cirrus tool, because as I said to you, you have to have those in before you start doing calculations. So does that clarify any questions that you had around those 2 points? You happy? Go for it.
I have a question, but I'm also confused how I should put it, or something like that. So, okay, what I'm getting is the emission factor is the amount of emission emitted for each fuels, either methane, carbon, and whatnot. And this is like what you're showing us right now. Is it what Eskom calculated in what they have emitted in terms of carbon? does it include the emission factor? Does it also include what the emission in which they were generating the electricity? Also, the mining part while they were mining the coal, the trucks. Does it go down to the? Yeah, I don't know.
That's a really good question. So thank you for raising that. So the answer to that is this emission factor only takes into account the burning of the coal to produce the electricity. Okay. It does not take into account the mining and the trucks and all of those components, because those are reported in terms of the GPC under different sectors. So we've got a place to record coal mining and the fugitive emissions from coal mining, and we've got a place to report transport, and then electricity is reported separately. The number you're talking about there is something called a life cycle emissions factor, and that's a different sort of calculation approach, if you like. But the way the GPC is structured, in order to avoid double counting primarily, and also to do with boundaries and that kind of thing, it reports each of those things separately, because you don't want the electricity people, Eskom, to report the numbers from mining and the mining people to report the numbers from mining. So you only report from those individual activities in the different sectors and subsectors. Okay, so this is just an electricity emission factor from burning the coal to produce electricity. Okay, yeah. Oh. Thank you. Cindy, you had a hand up. Oh.
No, you've covered what I wanted to comment on with regards to the grid emission factor. So good, thanks.
Okay, perfect, Cindy.
So can you just quickly talk about, I must confess, I've not read those. Okay, so Eskom publishes an emissions factor, 2022 DFFE grid emissions. Eskom is grid based, and then
So Eskom's not the only people who feed into the grid, because we have all our IPPs as well.
Okay. Right.
So what you want to do is get something that is truly representative of the whole country, which includes Eskom and everybody else who's generating. And so that's why you take the DFFE factor to account for your IPPs, because that obviously brings down your emissions factor, because a lot of our IPPs are renewables, and that's why it's somewhat lower. Right, I'm not seeing any other questions online. So, okay, so should we have a quick bash at trying to put these into the Cirrus tool? All right, because I think it'll help to engage with that a little bit more on what this looks like. So we turn over to our Cirrus tool now, and I'm hoping it'll still share. No, it hasn't. Okay, let me just reshare that. Okay, so we go over to our Cirrus tool over here, and we look for a tab which says emission factors. So I want everybody to try this. Okay, and we have to add the rows. So in my previous slide, sorry, let me just see if I can share this more like that. I think this will be better. Okay, so we've got two lots of emission factors that we want to put in. There are 4 fuel-related emission factors, being coal, diesel, petrol, and natural gas. And we want to put in an electricity emissions factor as well, because all of our exercises that we're going to be working with are going to use these 4 emission factors, at least for the next 2 days. So we go over to our Cirrus tool, and remember there was a button on the side here which says add. So we want to add into this thing 5 rows. Thank you. Right, and I click on the number 5 and it works. It gives me 5 rows. Okay, so I go back to my little table on the side there, and it is the first thing that we want to add in is coal. Now, just to alert you to this, I've just used one kind of coal here, but are different kinds of coal used in different applications that give rise to different emission factors. So we're just dealing with a simple one for the purpose of this, but you might want to try and get data that relates to different kinds of coal. So we click on the little pull down button, and there's a couple of categories of coal. There's bituminous or black coal, there's coking coal, and manufactured solid fuels. So we're actually going to use bituminous or black coal. Yeah, so we're going to use the bituminous and black coal. Okay, I think I might have said in my slide, subbituminous. So we're going to then put in a unique identifier, which just helps us to understand what we are, to know what we're referring to there. So we call it, for example, EF coal. Okay. Now we have an option. Okay, we can either give it the total CO2 equivalents associated with burning our coal, or we can give it the individual gases from the burning of that coal. So if you remember my table, we had the different gases. We had 3 different gases, so I'm going to choose GHG. Okay, do you want to walk? He's happy. Thank you. Then we decide which assessment report we're getting our global warming potentials from, and we decided we were going to use the 5th assessment report. Okay, now it says to us, okay, in what units are your emissions factors? So if I go back to my table here, sorry, we see that they are in kilograms per terajoule. Okay, the Cirrus tool is very flexible in that it allows you to put in emission factors in terms of any kinds of units that you want to use. So if you found a source that gave it to you in kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of coal burnt, that would be fine. Or kilograms of CO2 per gigajoule of coal burnt, it would be fine as well. But these emission factors in that DFFE guide is in kilograms per terajoule. Okay, so there are 2 boxes to complete there, kilograms and terajoules. Everybody with me so far? Everybody online with me so far? Okay, I've got a thumbs up or 2 there. All right, please stop if not. Okay, now it's asking you is, give me the factors now in terms of CO2, methane, and N2O. So CO2 was 94,600. Okay, methane, and you can get them from my screen, was 1, and N2O was 1.5. Okay, happy so far? We fill in the white blocks, okay, not the gray blocks. Oh, sorry. I can certainly zoom it in, thank you. How's that looking? Better? Okay. So those were the 3 gases that we had information on. So we don't have to fill in any more over here. We'll come back to those later. And there are a couple of things that sorry. 94,600, 1, and 1.5. $94,600. Yeah, I think it's 94,600. I must just check on that. Yeah, it says 94.6. I'll just check up on that in a second. I think that the slide is a typo. So what we could do is we could just go to the document here and look for coal. I'm just going to check that number so we don't get some crazy numbers. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. So it should be 94,600 kilograms per terajoule. Okay. So the slide, sorry, there was a mistake here. It should be 94,600. On the slide was a mistake. It's correct in the spreadsheet there. Okay, everybody happy that so far? And then there are a couple of things. Remember, we said you've got to document as you go along. So there are a couple of things that we need to fill in here. It says, what is your expectation of data quality? And there's a high, medium, and low data quality expectation. I'm going to come back to that later. But because this comes from the IPCC or from the government guidelines, we're going to give it a high quality data rating. And then it says, what year is this data from? So we go back to our document and we have a look at when this was published. And it was, I think, 2022. So you say, okay, it was published in 2022. So we give it a year of 2022. We say it was national scale emissions factors. Okay. And then we say, where does it come from? And we say DFFE guidelines. Okay.
Okay, yeah, a little bit slower. Maybe just also mention the automatic calculations in the gray blocks.
Yes. Full name of the DFFE guidelines and a link there. So what are these? What are the calculations in the gray blocks there? Have a look at the units that are above here. So the N2O is in your tons of N2O, and then what the gray blocks do is it converts those to tons of CO2 equivalents. So it takes your, pardon? So it takes your emissions in actual figures of that gas, and it applies the global warming potentials as well as the conversion into tons to give you a tons of CO2 equivalent of your number. So it's already starting to do the conversions that are required to get into this common unit, the apples that Luann mentioned earlier, of tons of CO2 equivalents, which is ultimately what we want to add up our gases in terms of. All right.
No, we seem to have, I don't know, we've put in, maybe we're just checking the numbers because it's giving an error value.
Okay, let's have a look.
For the conversion of, oh, yours is fine. I don't know what's different.
Pardon?
No, what's different?
There's a hand. Go ahead, Sally.
Oh, it's 150.
Hi, no, my conversion factors and everything is fine. I just don't know where you got the second column from. I've now tried it a few times to import that second column stuff in. Did I miss something?
Sorry, the second column, as in
The unique identifier.
yeah, sorry, Sally, that one you type in. So it's just something that when you're working through your spreadsheet, you'll remember that this is the emissions factor for coal. So you could call it whatever you like. You could go EF underscore black coal or bituminous coal. So it's a preferred, it's your own option to specify.
Thanks.
Sure. Okay. I want everybody to then go and please put in the electricity
Sorry, yeah,
emission factor.
I don't know. Here we're getting like an error
No, I'm
value.
going to help you now.
Oh,
I just want those of you who have finished, please go ahead and put in natural gas and electricity. I'd like you to put in next.
Yeah, so maybe we'll just highlight that. Okay, so we just had an error in one of the sheets. So you must pay attention, depends on how your computer's set up as to whether it's using a full stop or a comma as the separator. So if an error is coming up, try it with the one or the other.
Sorry, we can't hear or see that page. We can't hear.
Sorry, yeah, there was just a question about the columns of CO2B and CO2 at.
Yeah. So when you specify CO2e, you just put it into the
What was that? What the? I would, yeah, for me, I would put I would put the source where you got it from, where you visually saw the numbers. Because if for some reason there was, let's say, a typing error or something, between the two different reports, say, for example, your numbers are consistent with what your data source is. That's, look, I don't think it has a big difference, but I would usually like to refer to the one where you saw the data, where you. Also, it's also quite good to, if you have a data source and it refers you back to another data source. The best approach is obviously to track back and find the original data source and check that it is correct, and then you would source the original, but it's wherever you see it. But if you can track it back to the original data source, track it back, check it in there, and then put that as the original data source.
Brett, we're not hearing you.
Sorry, I hope you can hear me now. So
Yes, thanks.
Thank you for letting me know. So somebody in the room just noted that, these units are in kilograms per terajoule and not per kilowatt hour. Somebody had put in per kilowatt hour or terawatt hour. So the units are probably the most critical, well, they're one of the very critical elements of putting in your data, because if you've got 1,000 out, then that's obviously going to carry through all the way to all of your results. So double check, triple check. And then I think, as Luann said, when you get to the end, you go back and you say, does that make sense? Otherwise there could be an error as early as your emission factors. Okay, I'm hoping everybody's reached the point of putting these in so that we can move on. All right. So emission factors were the starting point, and they're really what a lot of your inventory hangs off. Obviously, some of the later sectors, we're going to have to look at other emission factor addition, and we're going to have to look at other ways of calculation. But I think let's dive in now into this idea of the stationary energy subsectors. So stationary, in terms of the GPC, stationary energy is divided up into 8 subsectors, okay? So we talk about a sector and a subsector. So these 8 subsectors are residential buildings, okay, where people live, commercial and institutional buildings, and I'll define those on the next slides. Recognizing that the latest round of the GPC says you should report commercial and institutional separately. We've then got stationary energy in manufacturing industries and construction, so across the board industry. We've got energy industries, which I'll unpack for you a little bit later. And finally, this idea of energy use in agriculture, forestry, and fishing activities. So that's not the land use stuff, it's just the energy use stuff, falls under stationary energy. We then have a nice catch-all category called non-specified sources. So if we don't really know where this energy usage goes, we can put it into non-specified sources. Obviously, it's kind of a fallback position. And then we've got two categories for fugitive emissions, okay? Fugitive emissions from mining, from the coal side of things and transport of the coal and all the rest, and fugitive emissions from the oil and gas sector, subsector. Okay, yeah? All right. So let's start unpacking those in a little bit more detail. In a moment, just a reminder then of this idea of scopes of reporting in the GPC, okay? So scopes of reporting, as Sanu said already, we have, it's a way of structuring the information in terms of helping not only the understanding of where the emissions come from, but also in terms of being able to aggregate, okay, being able to add up emissions from cities or provinces to give you national level emissions. We want to avoid double counting, okay? So the scopes framework helps us to understand what emissions come directly from the city, what are associated with the city's activities, and also helps us to separate out those emissions that we don't want to double count on. Okay, that's the sort of simplistic way of saying it. So the scope 1 emissions are all those emissions that happen within the city boundary, okay? If we have an industrial process within the city boundary, that's a scope 1 emission. If we have transportation within the city boundary, that's a scope 1 emission. If we have treatment of waste and wastewater within the city, that is a scope 1 emission. And all kinds of stationary fuel consumption within, or combustion within the city boundaries, those all fall under scope 1, okay? The scope 2 relates to the electricity supplied to that city, and as well as heating and cooling. And of course, I'm using the word city here instead of province. So the electricity supplied into the province from elsewhere is your scope 2. And then scope 3 relates to activities that occur outside of your province's boundaries, but that are linked to the activities in the province. So if the province generates waste and that's taken outside of the province for treatment, that is a scope 3 emission, okay? The waste was generated in your city or in your province, but then it's taken outside of the province for treatment. Transmission and distribution of energy outside of the province is linked to the province's activities, but it might take place outside of the province. There's some idiosyncrasies there, and also various elements of transport might be included in scope 3. So we have the scopes framework. We're going to carry on reinforcing it through the training, but again, it's an important thing in terms of aggregation and understanding where emissions are arising as a result of activities for the province. Sorry, I went the wrong way. The other thing that I just want to give a reminder of is this idea of basic and basic plus reporting. Okay, I mean, it really says what it is. The basic reporting is for those provinces that are starting out, that have maybe got limited data or limited resources to report. The GPC says that as a minimum, you should report on a subset of the emissions categories. As emissions reporting becomes more sophisticated in your province, you can then expand and then claim to have your inventory in accordance with the basic plus reporting requirements. So basic is a smaller set of emissions that is included. Basic plus is an expanded set of emissions that are included. And for each sector, we will tell you what is included in basic and what is included in basic plus. Okay, everybody happy? Dan, anything you want to add? Yeah.
No, it's just looking at inputting the information. Maybe we can just put an example of the cirrus with the emission factors from the slide, just as an example in the folder.
So, sorry, just run
the cirrus data that we were just entering now with those a few emission factors. Maybe we can just put an example with the data filled in the folder.
In the folder, yes.
Yeah. So
I'm happy to do that. Yes, that's an excellent idea. So at the end of each day, or actually at the beginning of each day from tomorrow, we'll put in a completed cirrus tool with all the data so that you can cross-check your data against it. Yes, that's a great idea. Thank you. Okay, so so those are just the basics we wanted to reinforce from Cindy's presentation this morning. And let's have a look at the stationary energy sector. What is included in basic and what's included in basic plus? So in basic, you basically have all combustion of fuels within the city boundaries, as well as fugitive emissions in scope 1. Okay, we'll unpack this fugitive emissions in detail. And also the emissions associated with electricity supplied to the province, cooling and steam provided to the province. So basic is just burning your fuels, fugitive emissions, and electricity and cooling supply. Okay. And then if you want to move on to a basic plus, a more advanced inventory, then you can also include in it transmission and distribution losses and waste outside of waste boundaries. Oh, no, wait, that comes into the waste sector. Sorry. So if you want to go into basic plus, you also include transmission and distribution losses. Okay, so there's a slight expansion in terms of when you want to go into basic plus. So you're starting to see these pictures. You would have noticed them in Cindy's presentation. And they're a very useful tool that appears throughout the GPC to tell you what gets reported where. Okay, so you might not have sort of started to register what they are, but you'll see them in the sort of the upfront material in the GPC and through different sector chapters. And what it does is it gives you a color coding of what needs to be reported under the different sectors and subsectors. So this is taking the one for stationary energy, the one you can see on your screen. It gives you the subsectors down the left-hand side. And then what it says to you is what is scope 1, what is scope 2, what is scope 3. The green is what needs to be reported in basic reporting. So you'll see the blocks that are green. The purple needs to be reported in basic plus reporting. And then those little numbers are effectively a classification code. So each subsector is given a code which helps you identify it. So in terms of your question earlier about when you said included elsewhere, you could say this electricity was included in 1.2.1. And then you don't have to provide a link to it because there's a unique identifier that helps you show the relationship between the different emissions. So that's what these pictures are. We're going to flash them up through the training. It's the subsectors, it's the scopes, it's what needs to be presented in basic and basic plus. So it's if you like, a 3-dimensional or 4-dimensional diagram. I guess the 4th dimension is what the number of that section is. Okay, Jody, wait.
Thank you. So just I'm just trying to think. So, for example, Western Cape, we don't necessarily have power stations in our province. So I'm seeing the energy generation supply to the grid, scope 1. So is that covered there, or is it scope 3 because it's transmission from the north? Just how is that sort of allocated for?
Okay, that's a great question. I'll give you a brief answer and then we'll give you the longer answer when we come to that section. But basically, the whole thing about electricity generated and supplied to the grid, one needs to avoid double counting of that electricity with the category that says scope 2, emissions from consumption of grid electricity. So you can see there's a double counting potential there. On the one side, you are burning fuel, which is fed into the grid. On the other side, you are consuming electricity from the grid. So anybody who has, and so they separate those two things out to avoid double counting. You report both of those. If you do have some fossil fuel power stations in the province, you would need to report it. But we don't add them all together. So when we come to the results section, you'll see that that category that's in italics there does not get summed into the total scope 1 emissions for the province to avoid that double counting situation. So it's not strictly true we don't have power stations because we do have diesel peakers, okay? So those would be reported under that category. The italic category in 1.4.4 would be the diesel burned in Ankerlicht and Hurikwa, okay? But the where you would use the electricity that the province has consumed from the grid would be under scope 2 in each of the individual categories. Okay. Does that, I think that answers your question, is that right? All right, great. Any other questions around that? Okay, excellent. So now this is the big question, right? And I know this is rather a complex slide, so I'm going to spend a bit of time on it. The big question that everybody started with is, where do we get data? That's our biggest bugbear, is inventory compilers, right? So in a perfect world, we would have actual fuel consumption data. We'd have every number for what is used in residential buildings and what is used in commercial buildings and what is used for transport and what is used for agriculture. But in reality, none of us really have that. You might have a little bit of fuel of data, okay? When we come to the transport sector, we might have fuel sales data. In fact, we probably do, okay? In an ideal world, we would have all of the electricity sold to individual sectors. Eskom actually collects really great electricity data at the national level. Whether you can get hold of that at the provincial level, I think, is highly challenging because a lot of that data is confidential data. They keep it confidential. Okay, so first prize. Oh, that table's fighting back. So first prize would be actual data. And I mean, if you can go out there and when we go through the different categories, find the actual data that's used of consumption in different categories or subsectors, that would be ideal. In fact, we often don't have that. So this sort of second prize, I guess, is sample data, okay? Where if we have, so in many provinces, you might find that there is an indication of electricity demand or electricity used in different households in different LSMs, for example. Or you might have electricity used in low income, medium income, and high income households. Has anybody got that sort of data? Electricity is so from household surveys, for example. No? Okay. You might have it. You might have it. You might find that it is collected. You have to go and uncover it. Okay. So electricity data is quite well represented. Trying to find out how much coal is used for cooking and heating at different household scales is far more complicated. Okay, gas consumption up here in Gauteng, there is some piped gas for cooking. It is quite challenging to get that data. However, if you can get that data, that's really great, right? Because then what you can do is you can use this idea of a scaling factor to scale up to the whole province, okay? So if you can get hold of that electricity data on, you know, for low, medium, and high income households, kilowatt hours on average, it's a good sample size, then you can say, okay, from our census data, we know we've got this many households in that category, and we can just simply use a ratio. So you just take available data, total data, and multiply by the scaling factor by the available data. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? This is the critical part. So if you're not sure what I'm talking about, stop me. Joanne, feel free to chip in on anything here. Okay, so if we know we've got 100 houses that are low-income households, and 200 houses that are medium income households, and 50 houses that are high income households. Okay, we've taken a sample from those households. So 100 low income households, we've gone out and sampled them. 200 medium income households, we've sampled them, and 50 high income households, we've sampled them. What I mean by sample them, we've gone to them and we've said, how much electricity do you spend on electricity each month? And they say, we spend 1,000 Rand on electricity. We know the cost of electricity, so we can work out how many kilowatt hours they have used in each of those households per month. And we average it over those 100 households. Okay, you with me so far? So we can say there are 10 units used at 100 for low income households, there's 50 units used for medium income households and 100 units used for high income households. Okay, happy so far? And then we can go and have a look at our census data, and we say we've got 10,000 households in the low income bracket. Okay, and we know that on average, based on our sample size, we use 100 units a month. We can say, okay, that's our consumption for low income households. Okay, and then we go and look at our census data. We've got 50,000 medium income households. We know the average electricity usage for those households. Then we know how much is being used by medium income households. Yeah, so we're just using a sample, and then we're scaling that data to be representative of the whole province. We obviously can't go and sample 2 households because then we won't have a statistically representative data set. Okay, so you've got to make sure that you've got a big enough data set. And I'm sure your electricity department understands that sort of thing. So you can speak to them about what is a representative data set. Okay, we're happy. So it's really about scaling. Now I'm talking about households there. What the GPC actually requires you to do is for different commercial types and industrial types, which I'll get to in a minute, which becomes more complicated. Okay, so that's our second prize in terms of data availability. Okay. Well, we're now onto the harder ones. So those are, if you can do either of those, that would be great. But then what the GPC also says is that sometimes we actually can't even get that representative data to scale. So what they say is there are other options for generating activity data. Okay. So the third one that they identify is modeling. Okay. So what they say is you can go and have a look at residential buildings, for example, and say that for every square meter of residential building, one needs X kilowatt hours per year, okay, 500 kilowatt hours per year. Okay, they'll know that based on building construction and what sort of materials and where it's located. And they say, so there are models out there which say an average house built in Gauteng, uses X amount per square meter. And then you're trying to estimate the number of square meters of that kind of house to give you your total energy demand for residential. It's a bit more complicated, but there are people who are doing these kinds of analyses. So certainly at the national level, we work a lot with square meterage and how much electricity you need for residential houses, per square meter. And if you can have that data to do it based on different weather zones, great. But it's an option, is to go and see if there are people out there with models of energy usage. Remembering we always only talking about stationary energy use here. So are there models that say how much energy is used in buildings in our particular province? Okay. Happy? Okay. And then, I'm going to go to the fifth one there, actually, is sometimes we can just go and scale down the national data. Okay, I think Jody was asking about this over lunch, is if we say, okay, we haven't got any other data available to us, but we know from the national inventory that this particular sector uses X amount of, or uses this amount of electricity. So we have something called a national energy balance that's put out fairly frequently. And it says that in residential buildings, we use this much coal as a country. Or in commercial buildings, we use that much gas as a country. So we've got a national picture of the energy use for different energy carriers in different subsectors for the country as a whole. And then what we would do is we would say, okay, what is a meaningful way of scaling that down to our province. So if it's residential, for example, it might make sense to do it on population, right? So our population has 15% of our province has 15% of the population. So let's say we use 15% of the coal in residential use. Yeah. It's a good proxy. It's a good indicator of what our coal use might be, assuming standard patterns of use of energy across the province, or across the provinces. Make sense? We know at the national level, we use 1,000 tons of coal per year in the residential sector. Okay. Residential sector is linked to population. So if we've got 10% of the population in our province, we possibly using about 10% of the coal that's used nationally in our province. Okay. It's okay-ish. It's not great because it doesn't take into account weather patterns and levels of economic development and all that sort of thing, but it's an option. So if we don't have the data, let's look at the national numbers and see what's available to us. So if it's residential use of coal, that's great. If it's industrial use of coal, does it make sense to do it on population? No. What would you do it on? So the right answer is no. What would you do it on? Any thoughts? Just makes sense not to do it on population. Any ideas on what you could do it on? Anybody from the floor? Yeah. Amount of industries or factories, that's an option. Oops, we lost the call. Anybody online, what could you use? Lisa?
So what we use is the air quality atmospheric emission license data. So it doesn't give us the full picture, but it gives us an indication for the large users, because as part of their license, they've got to give an indication of how much of the fuels they be using every year or annually. So we're using that as a kind of a proxy for coal for industrial purposes. It's
Brilliant.
not, as I said, it's not a full picture, but it's the most consistent form of source of data that we've been able to find for coal.
Great, thanks, Lisa. Yeah, please carry on.
Okay, Lisa, that would make sense actually. Taking me back now to my days, other life. But now, what would you do with the things, these other facilities that are below the AEL threshold, like your control emitters? Would you? I just don't remember if you would have the same benefits as that level of data from those. I just developed a database for all of them, but I don't remember if I would actually get that information in order to compile that database of the control emitters. What would you do with those ones?
Sorry. So we actually don't have that information for the controlled emitters. I know that our air quality colleagues, and some of them are in the online as well, have been looking to get actually a database of those controlled emitters, but we don't actually have access to that data. I think the Western Cape is is not a very industrialized province. So we kind of just ignore it. And it's not included because we don't have access to that data at this stage. But we're constantly looking for ways to improve the quality of data that we have. And when that is more easily accessible in a standardized format, we will be adding it to it. But you know, the assumptions and methodology section of our reporting is quite lengthy, because there are a lot of things to consider in terms of what we have and what we use. And yeah, but I think because, yeah, I see Sally's got her hand up. She's our air quality colleague in the Western Cape. But I think, yeah, it's just about kind of, for us, it's been more about having a consistent source of data, and we'll fill in the gaps where and how we can.
Great, thanks, Lisa. Sally, go ahead.
I actually just wanted to confirm what Lisa said. And what we are doing is we are busy compiling an emission inventory with Section 23 facilities. Thanks, Lisa.
Great, thanks, Sally.
So I was going to say, but Cindy, do you know if I just honestly I don't remember. Do you know if National has actually developed a standard, not really a standard, but a standard for some formats to capture that information, just like we would capture for the Section 21 facilities?
Yes and no. So within the National Emissions Inventory System, there was a component that was developed for controlled emitters. And I know some companies were reporting under Section 23, but also with that, there was an issue of compliance, but there is some data available at the national level for the small boilers.
Great, thanks, Sydney. Any other thoughts or questions? Matthews, please go ahead.
I'm not sure how to ask this question. There was a specific example that I just forgot. In this specific case, National had no data and there was no way of modeling in time, but Limpopo had a survey done. The question was, should we use Limpopo's data? Because the provinces are just a bit different to each other.
What was that data for?
I can't remember what it was.
Sorry, you forgot what data it was for.
Yeah. I wish Mark was here. He's the one who actually was disagreeing with the actual use of the Limpopo data. But if otherwise, I'll come back tomorrow, I think.
Okay.
Yeah. But I think the question is, because of some of the structural differences of the provinces, would you recommend using another province's data, or national would be better placed than you will write down?
My personal view, and I'm very interested to hear from my colleagues as well, is that you've really got to look at what data you are using. So if it's, as Lisa said, we're not Western Cape is not a highly industrialized province, and we don't have much generation in the Western Cape. So to use Mpumalanga data for I'm using an extreme example here. Whereas residential, you could maybe argue that it's less far off. We recognize their differences, but you have to be quite critical about using other provinces' data as to which emissions category you're talking about. That would be my view.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, but I mean, it's also, you also have to think about the fact you're either not putting anything in. So, and I think it's just what you said. I mean, you could take the data and then perhaps apply assumptions to that data to scale it in terms of whatever it is. Does it have industries? How much are yours relative to that? And scale it down. Perhaps just apply some kind of reasonable assumptions and document those. So, because I don't know, for me, it's better to have a number than nothing, because you can always go back and refine. But obviously, you do try to use as practical and useful assumptions as possible to that data.
The notation, what was it? Are they not applicable now?
Notation keys,
Not
yeah.
yet?
We will start seeing where you put them in. But yes, they are applicable the whole way through. So there's two things I think you've got data quality and notation keys are the two things. So I mean, the data quality is more about, is it your own province's survey, or is it, measured data is your data quality? Your notation keys is a little bit more about included elsewhere or not estimated. Those are what's referred to as the notation keys. It's a bit of terminology in this thing, but we will use
I'll say, so now here, can't we have a situation of not estimated? That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, so if you don't have data, you would say not estimated. I mean, I think it's also relative to, if you have a small piece of data and it's a really small component of your inventory and it's going to take a whole lot of effort to, so you want to focus your efforts around the big sectors that are most important, and focus on getting those ones right. And then if, the smaller ones, if there is some data, but you haven't quite got there, you can say not estimated. But I mean, first you should always start with what's most important and try and get those as accurate as possible. And then if you don't have, so not estimated is basically if you don't have any data, or maybe you could say not estimated and say, well, you did have this little small data, but it wasn't very good quality, or it wasn't then, so it's noted so that maybe next time someone can go back to it and relook at it.
Thanks, Luann. Any other thoughts? Anybody online had any experiences around this?